In the 9th century, a ruling Islamic dynasty mobilized what was basically an absolute titan of a workforce for one singular obsessive mission.
Yeah, and it's wild when you think about what that mission actually was.
Right, because they weren't marching to war. They weren't, building a new capital city.
Yo, not at all.
They were marching into the blistering heat of the Egyptian desert, basically to tear down the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Which is just a staggering image when you really try to picture it. I mean, an entire empire's logistical might aimed squarely at a giant pile of rocks.
Exactly. So the Caliph al-Ma'mun ordered this, and they brought in massive crews. They hammered, they bored, they chiseled, just completely exhausting thousands of men.
And it took an incredible toll.
Yeah, and after all of that unimaginable effort, they barely managed to scratch the surface. I mean, they bored a single visible hole, they hit an interior chamber, and then essentially just gave up.
They had to. They were totally defeated by it.
Right. And because they couldn't comprehend how they failed to destroy it, rumors instantly started flying around that they were actually just looking for buried treasure.
Which is, a classic human defense mechanism.
Happily.
If you fail at something that seems like it should be simple, like knocking down an old building, you rewrite the narrative. You invent a treasure hunt. Or, even more profoundly, you invent giants.
Right, which brings us to the core of what we are doing today. If you are listening to this on your commute right now, or maybe taking a walk through your downtown, I want you to just look at the buildings around you.
Take a good look.
Yeah, we look at a skyline, the concrete, the steel, the sheer towering weight of it all.
Yeah.
And we assume it is permanent. We view our cities like geology, right? Like mountain ranges that we just happen to build.
It is deeply comforting to think that way. I mean, we inherently crave stability.
We do.
We want to believe that human progress is this unending upward trajectory, and that a skyscraper is the ultimate indestructible proof of that progress.
But today, we are going to completely shatter that comfort. Welcome to today's deep dive. We're exploring a truly staggering historical document today.
Oh, it really is.
We're looking at excerpts from the Muqaddimah, specifically chapters 4 and 5, written by the 14th century philosopher, historian, and just all-around genius, Ibn Khaldun.
Genius is the right word for him, yeah.
And our mission today is to decode what is essentially an ancient, completely ruthless masterclass on urban economics, human psychology, and the absolute biological inevitability of a city's rise and fall.
Calling it a masterclass almost feels like an understatement, to be honest. When you immerse yourself in this text, it is genuinely jarring to remember it was written in 1377.
1377.
Right. Ibn Khaldun is dissecting societal mechanics with this cold, clinical precision that you usually don't see until the late 19th or 20th centuries.
That is what blew my mind going through your notes in these sources. I mean, we're talking about highly sophisticated theories of supply and demand, the labor theory of value, centuries before Adam Smith even existed.
Way before.
And, the epidemiological effects of stagnant air, the bizarre psychological paranoia of real estate cycles, it's all in there.
And he doesn't just list these things as historical trivia either.
Right.
He weaves them together to show that a city is not a mountain range. It is a living, breathing, incredibly fragile organism with a very strict biological lifespan.
And so my goal for us today is to navigate the why behind these massive historical patterns. Ibn Khaldun isn't just cataloging kings and wars.
No, he is revealing the hidden architecture of human civilization itself. He shows us how geography, power dynamics, and really the darkest corners of human nature intersect to build these massive empires.
And how those exact same forces eventually, almost mathematically, tear them apart.
Exactly.
So let's start with the most counterintuitive claim in the entire text, because I think it really sets the foundation for everything else we're going to talk about.
Let's do it.
You and I, and probably you listening right now, tend to assume that cities are just the natural end goal of human evolution. Like if you put enough humans in a fertile river valley, they will eventually just naturally cooperate and build a city.
Because city life is objectively easier and safer.
Right. But Ibn Khaldun aggressively pushes back on that. He says cities are entirely unnatural. They are forced, artificial ecosystems.
He is incredibly explicit about this sequence of events. He posits that dynasties and a royal authority must exist prior to towns and cities. The city is merely a secondary product of royal authority.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. But to understand this, we have to introduce a concept that is really the beating heart of Ibn Khaldun's worldview, and that concept is asabiya.
Okay, wait. Asabiya. Let's not gloss over that, because I know it's central to his whole philosophy. What exactly are we talking about here? Is it just like patriotism.
It is much deeper than patriotism. Asabiya translates roughly to group feeling or social cohesion. It is this intense, almost survival-level bond that forms among people who face extreme hardship together.
Okay, so it's born out of struggle.
Exactly. Ibn Khaldun argues this feeling is strongest in Bedouin life. You know, the nomadic, tough, desert-dwelling existence where you are constantly exposed to the elements.
And to rival tribes, I assume.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Out in the desert, your survival depends entirely on the person standing next to you. You share blood, you share struggle, you share profound defensive unity. That is asabiya.
So out in the desert, you don't need a wall because your neighbors are the wall.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. But here's the paradox. That intense group feeling makes a tribe incredibly powerful. They conquer their rivals, they accumulate wealth,
Right.
and eventually the leader of that triumphant tribe establishes a dynasty. And once you have a dynasty, the priorities instantly shift from raw survival to tranquility, luxury, and rest.
Because they want to enjoy the spoils. I mean, you don't want to sleep on the sand if you're the king.
Precisely, you want a palace.
Yeah.
And this is where the city comes in. The text states that human beings do not naturally desire to build huge monuments or organize at a massive scale just for the fun of it.
Right, the average person just wants to secure their own food and hang out.
Exactly. To build a massive city with walls, bathhouses, paved roads, that requires an unfathomable amount of coordinated labor. People literally have to be forced to do it.
The text actually uses a great phrase for this, the stick of royal authority.
Yes, they are driven by the stick of a centralized power, or they are stimulated by a massive financial carrot.
Yeah.
You know, a promise of reward so huge that only a royal dynasty could possibly afford it.
Let me try to map this onto a modern equivalent because it really reminds me of the debate around remote work and these mega corporate campuses.
Oh, that's an interesting angle.
Yeah, think about a massive tech corporation deciding to build a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar company town headquarters. Right. And then the CEO issues a strict return to office mandate.
Right, forcing everyone back.
Exactly. The individual software engineers naturally might want their own space. They want to work from a cabin in the woods or a quiet suburb. It requires this centralized, massively wealthy power, like the CEO or the board, to force immense coordinated density. Left to their own devices, the workers disperse. So without a king, do we just not get cities?
That is a brilliant modern mapping of the concept. The individual mandate is always personal optimization and comfort. Coordinated density on a massive scale requires coercion.
Whether that's the threat of losing your job or the promise of an inflated salary.
Exactly. In Ibn Khaldun's framework, a city is essentially the physical manifestation of a dynasty's desire for control, luxury, and defense.
Let's dig into that defense aspect for a second, because you mentioned earlier that in the desert, your courage and your tribe protect you.
Yep.
But in a city...
In a city, you basically outsource your courage to the architecture.
Wow. Outsource your courage.
Yeah, the text points out that overpowering a city is incredibly difficult because the walls act as a force multiplier. A city is worth a great number of soldiers. You don't need that intense shared asabiya to defend a fortified position. You just need thick stone and a few archers.
So the king builds the city to protect himself from his rivals, so he can sit back and enjoy his luxury without sleeping with one eye open.
Right.
But that creates a massive vulnerability, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
if the city only exists because the king forced it into existence, what happens to the city when the king is gone?
The text is chillingly definitive on this. It says, the life of the dynasty is the life of the town. Because the city is entirely an artificial creation, its lifespan is completely tethered to the lifespan of its founder.
So if the dynasty falls.
If the dynasty is short-lived, the life of the town stops the very moment the dynasty collapses. The civilization recedes, and the town simply falls back into ruins.
It just vanishes back into the dust, the artificial gravity is turned off, and everyone floats away.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. But conversely, if the dynasty lasts for centuries, the town expands boundlessly. The text uses Baghdad as the ultimate example of this.
Oh, Baghdad, right.
Under a long-lasting dynasty, Baghdad expanded so far and wide that it absorbed over 40 adjacent towns.
And the sources mentioned the public baths in Baghdad, which I have to admit completely derailed my brain for a minute.
Oh, the numbers are just staggering.
Yeah.
Citing the historian Al-Khatib, the text notes that during the time of Al-Mamun, the number of public baths in Baghdad reached 65,000.
65,000 public baths.
It's hard to even process.
Just try to conceptualize the plumbing, the water routing, the fuel needed to heat 65,000 baths. It is an almost incomprehensible level of urban infrastructure.
But, it raises a huge question.
What's that?
We know historically that some cities do survive a change in power. Kings die, dynasties fall, but the city just keeps humming along. How does Ibn Khaldun account for that?
He accounts for it through geography. He introduces a survival mechanism that we might call desert influx.
Okay, desert influx. Walk me through the mechanics of that.
Imagine a dynasty builds a magnificent city, but eventually that dynasty is destroyed. The artificial gravity, as you put it, is turned off. If that city is isolated, it dies.
But if that city is surrounded by a desert, and by desert, Ibn Khaldun means rugged mountains or flatlands populated by tough nomadic people, that geographic environment provides a constant, refreshing influx of human capital.
Because the nomads eventually want a piece of the good life.
Precisely. The people out in the rugged areas eventually reach a point of relative profitability and ease, and they start looking for tranquility.
So they see the city and think, I want that.
Exactly. They see the towering walls and the established infrastructure of the city, and they migrate inwards. They naturally seek out the path of least resistance.
So they're constantly replenishing the city's population, bringing fresh labor and fresh energy, keeping the lights on even when the original government has collapsed.
Yes, and the text gives specific historical examples of this geographical safety net in action.
Like which ones?
Cities like Fez and Bougie in the west and non-Arab Iraq in the east. They all survived political upheaval because their population was constantly replenished from the surrounding mountains and rural tribes.
This maps so perfectly onto modern urban dynamics.
It really does.
Think about cities like New York or London. They are incredibly expensive, highly stressful environments that constantly burn people out.
Oh, absolutely.
People age out and leave for the suburbs all the time. The only reason those cities maintain their massive scale is because they are constantly fed by a global influx of ambitious young people and immigrants who want the infrastructure and the opportunity the city provides.
That's a great point.
The city relies on outside energy to survive its own internal attrition.
I would take that analogy a step further, actually. Ibn Khaldun would say that without that constant immigration, a city is doomed.
Wow. Doomed?
Yeah. If a town does not have a nearby desert to draw from, if it lacks that constant influx, then the destruction of the ruling dynasty leaves it completely unmaintained.
Do we have examples of that failing?
The text cites late-stage Baghdad and the city of Al-Qayrawan as prime examples. When their political or geographic circumstances shifted and the influx stopped, they simply bled out. The population dispersed, and the civilization decayed into nothing.
Man, so if it takes this immense, almost unnatural, centralized coercion just to get people to live together, it must take an absolutely staggering level of coordination to build the megastructures inside those cities.
No, unquestionably.
Which leads us perfectly back to our opening story about the pyramids. Let's talk about section 2 from our sources, the illusion of giants and the immortality of monuments.
This is perhaps Ibn Khaldun's most fascinating psychological observation, in my opinion. He is diagnosing a cognitive bias that plagues how human beings perceive the past.
Especially when the physical remnants of that past completely dwarf our own current capabilities.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the ancient aliens theory, basically. I mean, when we look at something like the pyramids or the Roman aqueducts, the sheer scale of the stone is baffling.
It breaks your brain a little bit.
You look at a multi-ton block of limestone, perfectly elevated 400 feet in the air, and you just think, how? And Ibn Khaldun addresses this directly. He argues that large monuments are never the product of a single dynasty, let alone a single person.
He establishes a core rule of massive construction here. The size of the monument is directly proportionate to the importance and the organizational power of the dynasty that builds it.
Organizational power, not physical power.
Right. Constructing these megastructures requires united effort, vast numbers of workers brought together from all regions, and crucially, time.
Time, yeah.
It requires successive periods. One ruler starts it, a second continues it, a third finishes it.
And it requires technology. He specifically calls out machines in the text.
He is very explicit about that. He mentions pulleys and engineering mechanics. He notes that unaided human strength is completely insufficient for these tasks. You must have machines to multiply the power and strength needed to carry those massive loads.
But then he points out the tragedy of human memory, because later generations completely lose the context of that massive coordinated effort.
Yes, and this is where human hubris and a total lack of imagination come into play.
Lack of imagination, yeah.
Yeah. Later generations walk among these great monuments, like the reception hall of Khosrow, the pyramids of Egypt, the arches of the Malga at Carthage. They look at the massive stones, they look at their own physical weakness, and they just cannot mentally bridge the gap.
They can't fathom the teamwork, so they assume the builders must have been physically superhuman.
They literally invent myths. They assume that the ancients erected these monuments by their own unaided physical power. They imagine that the builders had bodies perfectly proportionate to the monuments.
That they were literal giants.
Exactly. Literal mythological giants, much taller, wider, and heavier than the people of the present day.
I love this observation because it is so enduring. We still do this today. When I read this, I immediately thought of, like, tearing down legacy code in the software engineering world.
Oh, that's a brilliant comparison.
Or trying to demolish a massively overbuilt concrete bunker from the Cold War. You look at 10 million lines of deeply intertwined legacy code running a major bank.
Yeah.
Right. And a modern programmer thinks the engineers who wrote this 30 years ago must have been absolute superhuman geniuses.
Right, right.
But that's a myth. It wasn't one giant genius. It was 500 perfectly average programmers working in organized shifts over 20 years, driven by relentless project managers with a massive budget.
Yes.
We mistake the incredible power of organizational coordination over time for literal individual giantism.
That is a phenomenal parallel. We romanticize the output because we are blind to the tedious generational process that created it. And Ibn Khaldun provides a brilliant philosophical proof for this regarding the sheer scale of the effort.
What's the proof?
He points out that later dynasties often find themselves completely unable to even destroy these monuments, let alone build them.
Which is wild, right? Because intuitively, tearing something down is always exponentially easier than building it.
That is the exact logical framework he uses. He argues that destruction is simply a return to the origin, which is non-existence. Construction is the forced opposite. Therefore, destruction should fundamentally be much easier. Entropy is on your side.
Right. I mean, breaking a stained glass window takes 1 rock in 2 seconds. Blowing the glass takes a master craftsman days.
Exactly. So Ibn Khaldun argues, when we encounter a building that our combined human strength is too weak to tear down, even though tearing things down is the easier action, we are forced to realize that the organizational strength used to construct it must have been astronomically large.
So immense that it couldn't possibly be just one ruler.
Right, so immense that it could not possibly be the work of a single ruler or a single generation.
Tell the story about the reception hall of Khosrau, because I think it perfectly illustrates how frustrating this must have been for later rulers.
Oh, it must have been maddening. So the Islamic ruler Ar-Rashid had the explicit, politically motivated intention of destroying the Great Reception Hall of Khosrau.
Which was an ancient Persian monument, right?
Yes. He wanted to erase the legacy of the previous empire, so he threw his workforce at it, but he was simply unable to do it.
He just couldn't knock it down.
The sheer structural integrity of the architecture defeated the concerted effort of a ruling dynasty. He had to abandon the demolition.
It's humiliating. You are the absolute ruler of the known world, and you can't even knock over your predecessor's living room.
It really is.
And we already talked about Caliph al-Mamun and the pyramids in the intro, but the detail about the Carthage arches in the text is just as crazy.
The arches of the Malga at Carthage, yes. Ibn Khaldun notes from his own personal observation in his youth that the people of Tunis desperately needed stones for their own buildings.
So they tried to recycle the old Roman ones.
Right. The local craftsmen highly valued the ancient Roman stones from the aqueduct arches because the quality was so high. For a long time, they formed organized parties to go out and attempt to tear them down to recycle the materials.
They were basically trying to strip the copper wire out of the ancient walls.
In a sense, yeah, exactly. But Ibn Khaldun observed that even the absolute smallest part of those walls came down only after the most immense, agonizing effort. The mortar and the structural design were so resilient that it barely yielded to concerted mining.
It's like the ancients build with superglue. But here is the fascinating pivot.
Okay.
A dynasty can have all the wealth in the world. They can have the pulleys, the generations of workers, the brilliant engineering. They can build indestructible, giant monuments, and none of that matters. The city will still turn into a disease-ridden ghost town if they ignore the basic, unforgiving rules of geography.
Yes.
Which brings us to the art and the massive failures of city planning.
The requirements for planning a town, as laid out by Ibn Khaldun, are shockingly pragmatic. The ultimate goal of a town, remember, is to provide a place for dwelling and shelter once a nation has achieved luxury and desires tranquility.
You want to relax, so you need a safe place to do it.
Therefore, you have to protect the town from two distinct categories of threats: human enemies and environmental hazards.
The human enemies part seems straightforward. Build a wall.
Build a wall, yes, but also maximize the natural terrain.
How so?
Well, he argues that all houses must be inside a surrounding wall, but ideally the town should be situated in an inaccessible place to begin with.
Like up on a mountain.
Either up on a rugged hill, or surrounded by the sea, or a deep river, so that an enemy can only reach it by crossing a single bridge. You are mathematically multiplying the inaccessibility of the location.
Location, location, location.
Exactly.
But the environmental threats part is where I think Ibn Khaldun truly earns his genius status. I mean, he gets incredibly scientific, centuries ahead of his time.
He really does. He applies a pure, observable rationalism to environmental science that is just striking for the 14th century.
What does he look at specifically?
He argues that to protect towns against harmful atmospheric phenomena, you must ensure the air is wholesome to prevent illness.
Right.
He states, as a fact of direct observation, that when air is stagnant or close to corrupt waters, putrid pools, or swamps, it is speedily affected by putrescence, and anyone living in that environment will inevitably fall sick.
He is basically laying down the foundational tenets of public health and epidemiology here. Bad water and stagnant air equal disease.
Yes.
And what's brilliant is how he actively uses this rationalism to relentlessly mock the superstitions of his own era. We have to talk about the story of Gabes.
Oh, it's a perfect encapsulation of his mindset. So in the Maghreb, there was a town called Gabes that was infamous for its terrible air. The text notes that very few inhabitants or visitors were ever spared from what they called the putrid fever.
So it's essentially a malaria zone.
Right, essentially. Now, an earlier historian named al-Bakri had written a widely accepted account of why Gabes was so unhealthy.
And it wasn't mosquitoes.
No, it was not. Al-Bakri claimed that during an excavation, someone dug up an ancient copper vessel that was sealed with lead. When the workers broke the seal, a puff of smoke came out and vanished into the air.
Uh-oh.
And from that exact moment onward, feverish diseases began to relentlessly plague the town.
The classic magic smoke in a jar theory of epidemiology. If you open the cursed jar, you get malaria.
Right, the implication being that the vessel contained some sort of ancient magic spell that was actively keeping the pestilence at bay, and once they broke it, the disease returned.
And Ibn Khaldun reads this and is just filled with absolute intellectual contempt.
He roasts him, he dismisses it entirely, he calls it a prime example of the feeble beliefs and ideas of the common people.
He doesn't hold back.
He states bluntly that al-Bakri was neither learned nor enlightened enough to see through the nonsensical character of the story. He completely rejects the supernatural explanation.
So what was Ibn Khaldun's actual rational explanation for the sickness in Gabes?
He points to demographics, economics, and air circulation.
Okay, that worked.
He explains that previously, when the region enjoyed a flourishing, wealthy civilization, Gabes had a massive, bustling population.
Lots of people moving around.
Exactly. The constant daily activity of all those people, the fires, the movement, the construction, actually helped to keep the air circulating and clearing out the environment, preventing putrescence.
Wow, so the city itself was the ventilation system.
Right. But when the civilization eventually declined and the inhabitants dwindled, human activity dropped. The air became physically stagnant, the swamps encroached, the environment putrefied, and the incidence of disease naturally skyrocketed.
That is just brilliant. He connects the macroeconomic and demographic decline of a city directly to the physical, biological stagnation of its environment.
It's an incredible observation for his time.
But beyond just avoiding swamps and stagnant air, what else is on his mandatory checklist for a successful city?
Well, you need a checklist of fundamental physical resources. First, water is paramount. You must be situated on a river or near abundant springs with plenty of fresh drinkable water.
Naturally.
Second, you need good pastures nearby for livestock, because every householder needs animals for breeding, milk, and riding.
Okay.
Third, you need arable fields close by, because grain is the basic necessity of life, and proximity means it can be transported and obtained easily.
Right, you gotta eat.
And finally, you need abundant woods nearby to supply firewood for heating and cooking, and timber for building materials.
It sounds exactly like playing a city-building video game like Civilization or SimCity. You have to meticulously check all the geographic resource boxes before you place your town center, or your citizens are going to starve and riot.
That's a great way to think about it.
But the text gives some pretty brutal historical examples of what happens when founders ignore these rules, right? He heavily criticizes the early Arab planning failures.
Yes, he does. He is highly critical of how the early Muslim Arabs founded towns in Iraq, the Hijaz, and Ifriqiya at the very beginning of Islam.
Why? What did they do wrong?
He argues they failed to make good natural selections because they viewed geography purely through a Bedouin lens.
Okay, what does that mean? What is a Bedouin lens when it comes to city planning?
It means they were using a mental operating system optimized for the deep desert and applying it to a dense urban environment.
Ah.
They only looked for the things that mattered to a nomadic herder. They looked for pastures, sparse trees, and brackish water for their camels. They specifically wanted to be near the desert edge and the established caravan routes.
I joked in my notes earlier that they prioritized camel parking over human infrastructure. But it's actually a fascinating cognitive bias. If your entire life and wealth have been defined by the camel, of course you optimize your new city for the camel.
It's a perfectly logical decision within their original paradigm, but a disastrous one for sedentary city building.
Right.
The text explicitly states they did not see to it that there was sufficient fresh water for massive human consumption, rich fields for deep cultivation, adequate firewood, or lush pastures for domestic animals like cattle and sheep.
They just missed all the basics.
So cities like Kufa, Basra, and Kairouan were founded with this desert mindset, and because they possessed no natural geographic site and had no internal agricultural engines to feed a dense population, they were essentially doomed.
Doomed to fall into ruin the moment the political winds shifted.
Exactly.
They built cities without the biological organs needed to sustain them. They built a submarine and forgot to put in oxygen tanks because they were used to riding horses.
That is a very apt metaphor.
And there's another massive vulnerability he mentions regarding location, and that is the coast.
Coastal vulnerabilities are a major concern for Ibn Khaldun. The text warns that a coastal town must either be situated on a highly rugged elevation, or it must be surrounded by a massive population of fiercely loyal tribes.
Tribes who share its group feeling. It's Asabia.
Yes, tribes who will instantly rush to its defense.
But why is the coast so dangerous? I mean, we usually think of coastal cities as prime real estate today.
Because a city near the sea is uniquely exposed to surprise naval attacks, especially under the cover of night.
Ah, I see.
Think about it. If an enemy marches an army across the land, you have days or weeks of warning. You see the dust on the horizon.
You can prepare the walls.
Right. But a fleet can appear out of the mist and strike with total impunity. If you don't have a rugged mountain to retreat to, or a fierce local tribe to fight a pitched battle for you, the enemy fleet can sack the city before you even wake up.
And remember, the text notes that urban populations, accustomed to tranquility and luxury, do not know how to fight. They have lost their asabiyah.
They've lost their edge. They are soft targets.
Exactly.
Alexandria, Tripoli, Bone, and Sale are listed as highly vulnerable cities of this type. Alexandria is a particularly illuminating example, actually.
Oh, tell me about Alexandria.
Well, the Abbasids actually designated Alexandria as a border city.
Wait, Alexandria is in Egypt. Under the Abbasids, that was deeply inside their imperial territory. How is it a border city?
Geographically, you're right. It was internal. The Abbasid Empire expanded far beyond Alexandria. But psychologically and militarily, they called it a border city to express their deep paranoia and fear of unexpected attacks from the sea.
Because of its exposed situation.
The ocean was the border. And indeed, the text notes that Alexandria and Tripoli were attacked by enemies from the sea on numerous devastating occasions.
Wow. Okay, so let's say you survive all of this. You do it right. You pick a spot with crisp air, fresh water, rich fields, abundant woods. You build giant walls so the Navy can't surprise you, and you have a steady influx of labor from the mountains.
You've built a perfect city.
Once a city is properly placed and safely fortified, the population can actually take root. It grows, it scales up. And when that population becomes massive, the entire fabric of human economics flips completely upside down.
This is where we move into the truly groundbreaking economic theories in the text. The core principle Ibn Khaldun establishes here is that the wealth of a city is entirely dependent on the sheer size of its population.
I call this the economics of the swarm.
A fitting title, because he argues that human labor is what creates surplus.
Okay, I want to spend some real time walking through this because if you are listening to this, it might feel deeply counterintuitive at first glance.
It does until you really break it down.
Let's think about modern real estate and the cost of living. Let's compare New York City to a tiny, remote rural town up in the mountains. In NYC, a basic necessity, let's say a slice of pizza or a bagel, might be incredibly cheap and abundant. You can find it on literally any street corner for a few dollars.
Right.
But if you try to hire a specialized plumber, or buy a bespoke artisanal chair, or hire a private tutor, a luxury service, it will absolutely bankrupt you. The hourly rates are insane.
Because of the demand, yeah.
Whereas if you go to that tiny mountain town, you might actually worry about the local grocery store running out of fresh produce or basic bread during a severe winter storm. The necessities are fragile.
Yes.
But you don't have a massive, hyper-competitive market of billionaires driving up the price of high-end bespoke services because those services barely exist.
Your modern intuition is perfectly aligned with Ibn Khaldun's 14th century empirical observation here. He states clearly that in a highly developed city with a massive population, the prices of necessary foodstuffs, wheat, barley, onions, are low.
But the luxuries,
But the prices of conveniences or luxuries, specialized seasonings, rare fruits, intricate crafts are exorbitant. In a small town or a weak civilization, the exact opposite is true. Necessities are incredibly expensive, and luxuries are cheap or simply non-existent.
okay, why? Break down the mechanics of that. Why is food so cheap in a mega city? You'd think more mouths to feed equals higher food prices.
It comes down to the absolute necessity of procurement and the division of labor.
Okay.
Every single person, regardless of class, needs grain to survive. Nobody neglects their food supply. So in a massive city, a proportionately huge segment of the population is engaged in agriculture or the procurement and trading of food.
Everyone is focused on the basics.
Right. And because of the efficiency of the division of labor, every person who procures food creates a massive surplus far beyond their own family's daily needs.
Okay, so the sheer volume of workers creates a surplus.
When you have a massive population all generating surplus necessities simultaneously, the aggregate supply becomes astronomical. The market is literally flooded with food. Therefore, the price plummets.
It is so universally abundant that, barring a severe drought or siege, food is remarkably cheap.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Everyone is farming or trading grain, creating a mountain of it. It's a volume game. But why do luxuries become so incredibly expensive? If the city is so efficient at making wheat, why is it so expensive to buy a nice silk shirt?
Ibn Khaldun provides 3 distinct, highly sophisticated reasons for this. First, because the city is the center of luxury and tranquility, there is a massive concentrated demand for these conveniences. It is the cultural expectation to have them.
Right, everyone wants to look good.
Second, there are a lot of people in a big city with tremendous surplus wealth to waste. They actively bid against each other for these rare services and goods, driving the price up to astronomical levels.
Bidding wars, the classic auction effect.
Exactly. And the third reason is a brilliant insight into the psychology of the laborer.
Oh, I love this part.
In a big city where basic food is cheap and survival is relatively easy, specialized industrial workers and craftsmen place a very high value on their own unique services.
Because they aren't starving.
Right. They don't have to work every single day just to avoid starvation. They see the wealthy elites desperately competing for their specific skills, so they become, in Ibn Khaldun's exact words, arrogant.
Arrogant.
Yes. They demand significantly more for their services than their labor is ordinarily worth.
They hold all the leverage. The specialized artisan knows that the rich guy absolutely needs his specific rare seasoning or his perfectly woven brocade to impress the other rich guys at court. So the artisan jacks up the price. It's perfectly rational behavior.
It is entirely rational. So in a massive city, necessities are cheap due to massive oversupply, and luxuries are wildly expensive due to high demand, bidding wars among the wealthy, and the arrogance of specialized laborers.
And in the small town.
The mechanics work in reverse. In a small city, the labor pool is tiny, the surplus is negligible, the people live in constant low-level fear of food shortages.
So they hold on to what they have.
Exactly. So when extra food does come into their hands, they hoard it, they store it away, it becomes precious, and anyone who wants to buy it on the open market has to pay a massive premium to convince them to part with it.
Hoarding restricts supply and drives up the price of basics.
Precisely. And they have virtually no demand for luxuries because they are too poor and their numbers are too few. So the prices for those goods, if anyone even bothers to make them, remain incredibly low.
To illustrate just how vast the wealth gap becomes between a big city and a small town, the text uses an incredible, vivid example about beggars.
The beggars of Fez versus Oran.
Yes.
The author relates a fascinating personal observation. He saw beggars in the massive, heavily populated, thriving city of Fez during a festival.
And they weren't just asking for spare change.
No, these beggars were not asking for scraps of bread. They were successfully asking people passing by for meat, butter, complex cooked dishes, fine garments, and expensive household utensils.
They're literally begging for luxury goods.
Yeah.
And getting them.
Yes, because the surplus in Fez was so immense. But the author notes that if a beggar were to ask for those exact same luxury items in the smaller, significantly less populated cities of Tlemcen or Oran, they would be looked at with deep disapproval.
They'd be run out of town.
Treated harshly and chased away immediately, yes.
Because in the small town, those items are unimaginable treasures. In the big city, there is so much surplus wealth sloshing around the system that people will casually give away fine garments to someone on the street.
The surplus is everything. And this brings us to Ibn Khaldun's foundational economic theory. Keep in mind, he is writing this centuries before Adam Smith or Karl Marx. He argues that labor is the true fundamental source of all profit and wealth.
Wait, explain that, because people usually think of wealth as land or gold or just having a lot of stuff.
He states that profit is simply the value realized from human labor. If you earn capital from a craft like carpentry or weaving, that value is very clearly derived from your physical labor. You turned wood into a chair. But he goes further, and this is the genius part. He says that even if your profit comes from animals or plants or mining for gold and silver, human labor is still the essential active ingredient. Without human labor, no gain will ever be obtained from those natural resources. They will just sit there.
You can't just look at a mountain of gold and be rich, right? Someone has to spend months digging it out of the rock, refining it, and minting it. The gold is useless without the sweat.
Right. And he acknowledges that sometimes the share of labor is concealed. In agriculture, for instance, if farming requires very little care because the soil is perfect, people might easily forget how much human labor actually went into the final price of the grain.
And this is a really fascinating case study in the text regarding Spain that perfectly illustrates how the physical cost of labor directly dictates the cost of basic goods.
Yes, there is.
And just to flag for you listening, we are treating this as a pure, impartial economic case study from the 14th century, setting aside the geopolitics to just look at the math.
Yes, this is a brilliant, purely economic observation about shifting agricultural overhead. The text observes that when the Christian armies pushed the Muslims back to the rugged coastal territories of Spain, the Muslims lost access to the broad, fine soil and the good agricultural land.
They got pushed into the bad terrain.
They were forced to cultivate highly inferior, rocky soil that was little suited for vegetables or grain.
So the geography radically turned against them.
Exactly. Now, to survive and actually grow food in that terrible soil, the Muslim farmers had to invest heavily in treating the fields. They couldn't just throw seeds on the ground.
I'd work for it.
They had to use expensive, intensive human labor and procure expensive outside materials like fertilizer to make the ground yield anything. Because their agricultural activities now required considerable, constant expenditure on labor and materials, they had to factor those high overhead costs into the final market price of the food just to break even.
The overhead went through the roof, so the price of a loaf of wheat bread skyrocketed.
Consequently, Spain became an incredibly expensive region for basic foodstuff. The text contrasts this directly with the Berber countries in North Africa.
How do they compare?
Their fields had naturally fine, rich, good soil. They didn't have to procure expensive outside labor or import materials to treat the land. Because the labor input required to grow the food was so much lower, the food in their country remained remarkably cheap and abundant.
So it's not about how much magical gold a country has or what the stars say, which he also actively complains about astrologers claiming, by the way.
He hates the astrologers.
It's purely about the physical mechanics of labor, geography, and population density.
The author actually uses a profound metaphor to summarize this massive accumulation of surplus wealth in a populous city. He compares it to a wealthy household.
The animal swarm analogy.
Yes. He asks the reader to picture the premises and courtyards of a prosperous family, where grain and breadcrumbs are constantly scattered around due to abundance.
Just food everywhere.
That courtyard is naturally frequented by swarms of ants and insects. Rats live comfortably in the cellars. Cats flock there to eat the rats. Flocks of birds circle overhead until they are satiated by the scraps. The life is teeming.
Teeming with life.
But in the house of a poor person, with little sustenance and no wasted crumbs, no insects crawl, no birds hover, and no cats take refuge.
Because there are no crumbs. There is no surplus.
Precisely.
Right.
A large human population naturally generates this life-giving surplus, these economic crumbs, that attract and sustain a massive, complex swarm of human activity, specialization, and wealth.
If you are listening to this, I want you to think about the economic crumbs in your own city. Think about the entire industries, dog walkers, artisanal coffee roasters, hyper-niche tech consultants that only exist because the core economic engine of your city is throwing off enough massive surplus wealth to sustain them.
It's the exact same dynamic.
Okay, so this massive accumulation of surplus wealth creates a very specific class of ultra-rich individuals within the city, the sedentary capitalists. But here is where the story takes a very dark, paranoid turn. Because in a city ruled by an absolute dynasty, having too much money without having political power is a very, very dangerous game to play.
This is a critical vulnerability in the urban ecosystem. We move into the realm of real estate cycles and the intense paranoia of the wealthy class.
Paranoia is the right word.
The text asks a very pragmatic, modern-sounding question. How does an individual actually acquire limitless real estate and massive farms in a fully developed city?
Right, because nobody, not even a highly successful merchant, can just go out and buy half of Manhattan in one Tuesday afternoon. The capital required is too vast.
Exactly. The text states that limitless property is rarely acquired through sheer business savvy, a brilliant trade, or sudden purchase. Even in times of great economic prosperity, accumulating that much land is a slow generational process.
Passing it down.
It comes primarily through inheritance over many generations, where the property of many distant relatives eventually funnels down to one single heir. Or, and this is the far more dramatic mechanism, it is acquired through massive market crashes.
Buying the dip. But like a catastrophic 14th century dip.
We established that the life of the city is tied to the dynasty. When one dynasty enters its death throes and another begins to rise, the militia vanishes. Legal protection collapses. The city goes into ruin and chaos.
Absolute chaos.
In that terrifying moment of upheaval, real estate becomes practically useless. Nobody wants a mansion in a war zone. Values plummet to zero. Someone with liquid capital and nerves of steel can acquire massive amounts of prime real estate for historically low prices.
And then they just wait it out.
Then they simply hold on to it. By the time the city eventually regains its youthful vigor and stability under the new dynasty, those property values skyrocket back to the top.
The text literally calls this a fluctuation in the real estate market. It sounds like something you'd read in the Wall Street Journal today.
Yes, it does. And suddenly, the inheritor or the savvy buyer turns out to be one of the wealthiest men in the city, entirely due to market fluctuation, timing, and inheritance, not necessarily their own daily business effort.
But the text also points out why people try to accumulate massive real estate portfolios. And it's surprisingly poignant. It's not just to be a billionaire playboy throwing parties.
No. The core motivation is deeply human and deeply anxious. The text notes that vast estates and farms rarely yield enough liquid income to actually support a life of extreme daily luxury. The primary motive for acquiring all this dirt and stone is a profound concern for helpless children.
It's a medieval life insurance policy.
That is exactly what it is. The patriarch wants to provide for the education, upbringing, and survival of children or grandchildren who might be unable to earn their own living due to a weakness of body, a defect in mind, or just a lack of business acumen. Real property land becomes their permanent, indestructible support network when the patriarch dies.
Okay, but let's say you do it. You accumulate all this wealth through crashes and inheritance. You are a sedentary capitalist living in a massive compound in incredible luxury. You mentioned earlier that this is dangerous. Why?
Because by living in extreme luxury, you are now competing directly with the emirs, the generals, and the rulers of the dynasty.
You're showing off in front of the people who own the swords.
Exactly. Ibn Khaldun is brutal and unsparing about human nature here. He says aggressiveness and jealousy are deeply natural to human beings. When a commoner, a merchant without noble blood, lives in great luxury and throws their wealth around, the rulers inevitably become intensely jealous.
They want what he has.
They cast their eyes upon his possessions, and because the rulers hold all the levers of absolute power, they will try every possible trick to catch the capitalist in the net of a government decision.
I posed this question in my notes when I read this. What good is being a billionaire if the guy next door literally owns the police, the courts, and the military. It's like a hostile corporate buyout where the opposing board of directors has a literal army. You can't outlawyer a sword.
That is precisely the dynamic. The rulers will not just openly rob the capitalist, they want to maintain the illusion of order. They will find an obvious, flimsy legal pretext to punish him, issue a massive fine, and confiscate his property for the state treasury.
So they just rig the system.
The text explicitly, almost cynically, states that government decisions are, as a general rule, unjust.
And there's a religious and historical context he provides for his audience to explain why systemic justice is so incredibly rare, right?
Yes. To explain this baseline lack of pure justice, Ibn Khaldun references Islamic theology and prophecy. He notes that pure, uncorrupted justice was only truly found during the brief legal caliphate right after the Prophet Muhammad.
So it was a very short window.
He quotes the Prophet as saying, "The caliphate after me will last 30 years. Then it will revert to being tyrannic royal authority." So, for Ibn Khaldun, living under a tyrannic authority that will inevitably try to confiscate your wealth out of sheer jealousy is not an aberration. It is simply the baseline mathematical reality of human history.
So how does a rich person survive? If they can't trust the courts and they can't fight the army, what do? Do they just hide their money under the mattress?
To survive, the wealthy capitalist must do something very specific. They must buy rank.
Rank, meaning what exactly?
Yeah.
Like buying a title.
Meaning they need an institutional protective force. They must align themselves with a person closely related to the ruler, or a trusted inner circle friend of the ruler, or an influential, heavily armed tribal group that the government respects and fears.
A patron, basically.
The capitalist essentially pays them for a protection racket. In the shade of that purchased rank, the capitalist can live peacefully, safe from hostile government attacks. If they don't buy that protection, they will inevitably be swallowed whole by legal tricks.
Which, again, maps perfectly onto modern power dynamics. Think about massive modern corporations spending billions of dollars on lobbying or hiring former politicians to sit on their boards. They aren't doing that for fun. They are buying rank.
They are buying a protective shield against the regulatory and taxing power of the government.
It is the exact same survival mechanism, just wearing a different suit.
Absolutely.
So the city at its absolute peak is this incredibly wealthy, highly populated, deeply paranoid swarm of luxury, bidding wars, and political extortion. And this intense concentration of wealth and anxiety isn't just an economic peak. According to Ibn Khaldun, it is a biological turning point.
Yes.
When a city reaches this state of ultimate luxury, it is essentially entering its golden years.
Yeah.
Right before the dementia of senility sets in.
We have finally arrived at the senility of sedentary culture. This is the tragic downward arc of Ibn Khaldun's theory. Sedentary culture, which encompasses the ultimate refinement in cooking, dressmaking, architecture, and domestic economy, is the stated goal of civilization. It is what they were working for.
Right, it's the peak.
But it is simultaneously the beginning of the end of its lifespan.
It's a terminal diagnosis.
He compares it directly and literally to the physical life cycle of an individual human being. He says reason and medical tradition make it clear that 40 years marks the absolute end of an individual's physical growth. After 40, nature stops growing and begins its slow, inevitable decline.
Wow, applying human biology to a city.
He applies this exact biological limit to civilization. When urban luxury reaches its absolute peak of refinement, the culture does not plateau, it immediately begins to corrupt.
What does that corruption actually look like? Because we aren't just talking about the walls crumbling or the aqueducts failing yet. We're talking about the people inside them rotting from the inside out.
We are talking about severe systemic psychological and moral decay. The core economic issue driving this is that maintaining a lifestyle of extreme luxury requires vastly more income than basic survival. Over time, the customs of luxury morph into absolute necessities in the minds of the citizens. The expenditure of the inhabitants grows and grows until it is no longer reasonable. It becomes wildly extravagant.
And because we already established that specialized labor and luxury goods are exorbitantly expensive in a big city, everything they need to buy to maintain this baseline lifestyle drains their accounts.
Exactly. So they reach a point where their normal, honest income is no longer sufficient to meet the demands of their entrenched customs. To bridge that gap, to satisfy needs they can frankly no longer afford, the citizens turn to corruption.
They start cutting corners.
The text says the soul comes to use all possible trickery. People become devoted to lying, gambling, cheating, rampant fraud, theft, perjury, and predatory usury.
They bankrupt their morals to pay for their lifestyle. I liken this to a spoiled third-generation trust fund dynamic. The rugged founders, the Bedouins in this model, built the wealth through intense hardship and massive asabiya. The second generation managed the wealth. But by the third generation, the kids have grown up in such absolute tranquility and safety that they don't know how to defend themselves.
Right, they have no struggle.
They don't know how to fix a physical problem. But they feel entirely entitled to the wealth. And they are willing to commit wire fraud or embezzle just to maintain a country club lifestyle they haven't earned and can't actually afford.
I think that is a very accurate psychological parallel. They lose their religion and they lose their modesty. The text notes they begin to talk openly about immorality, completely abandoning the stoic restraint that was strictly required in the tough Bedouin culture.
And critically, fatally, they lose their physical courage.
Yes. Because they have been brought up in total tranquility, coddled by luxury, they are physically and mentally unable to repel harmful things. Their asabiya is completely gone. They become entirely, helplessly dependent on a paid government militia to defend them.
And the tragedy is amplified when a rugged outsider tries to enter this environment, isn't it?
The text makes a heartbreaking note about this. If a tough, honest Bedouin is attracted to the glitz of city life and moves in, they are instantly disgraced. They can't compete because they don't know the deceptive tricks of the urban trade, and the basic conveniences are far too expensive for their meager, honest desert income.
They just get crushed.
They are chewed up and spit out by the high-cost, highly deceptive environment of the senile city.
There's a really fascinating, almost poetic metaphor the text uses to describe this terminal stage of luxury, the orange tree prophecy.
Yes, the text mentions a prevalent saying among the common people of his time, that planting orange trees around houses invites the immediate ruin of a city.
Now, the commoners took this literally, right?
They superstitiously avoided planting them, thinking the tree itself was cursed. But Ibn Khaldun explains the true, deep philosophical metaphor behind the saying.
Wait, so they thought the trees were cursed, but Ibn Khaldun says it's actually an economic indicator.
Exactly. Orange trees, cypresses, and oleanders, at least in the specific agricultural context he is writing about, were viewed as plants that yield no practical edible fruit.
They are purely decorative. You can't eat them.
Right. Their only purpose is to give aesthetic color to gardens. They are the ultimate expression of useless luxury. Ibn Khaldun argues that when a society reaches a point where it allocates its most precious, vital resources, water, intensive labor, prime arable land, to cultivate purely useless aesthetic things, it means their ways of luxury have become completely over-refined and divorced from survival.
That's a huge red flag for a society.
This is the stage where one must deeply fear the destruction of the city. The orange tree isn't magic. It is a glaring economic indicator of terminal decadence.
It's the moment the civilization collectively chooses aesthetics over utility. And when that happens, the social fabric just tears apart.
The city becomes flooded with what he calls low people of blameworthy character. And the corruption is so pervasive that even people of noble descent are dragged down into the mud.
How so?
Because their education and moral upbringing have been completely neglected by the dying, distracted dynasty, and they are surrounded daily by normalized corruption. They are forced to adopt low occupations and engage in wrongdoing just to make a living and keep up appearances. The toxic environment absolutely corrupts their fine origin.
So the society is rotting from the inside out. The people are corrupt, they are broke, they are cowardly, and they are wasting water on orange trees. But what is the final blow? A city can languish in that state for a while. What actually pulls the plug on the heart monitor?
The final fatal blow is almost always a shift in the political winds. Specifically, the ruling dynasty crumbling from a coup, being conquered, or simply packing up and leaving.
Which brings us to the end of the line, the final collapse and the fading of culture.
We established at the very beginning that the life of the city is the life of the dynasty. When a dynasty disintegrates, the civilization of the city crumbles with it, and there is hardly ever any delay. It is an immediate shock to the system.
Why is it so fast? Why doesn't the city just keep trading on its own?
First, consider what happens if a new dynasty conquers the city. This new dynasty arrives from the outside, likely with a tough, aggressive Bedouin outlook. They will deeply despise the excessive, soft luxury of the old city. They will enforce strict, lower taxes and significantly lower government expenditures, which instantly starves the luxury economy. The artisans go out of business. The customs of luxury disappear overnight, and the sedentary culture vanishes.
And they probably hate the old culture, too.
Furthermore, the new conquerors view the partisans and the customs of their defeated rivals with intense political disapproval. They actively wipe out the old cultural fabric.
Okay, that makes sense for a conquest. But what if the dynasty isn't conquered? What if the king just decides to build a new palace somewhere else and move his capital?
That is equally fatal to the old city. The text describes the capital city as the world's marketplace. The government is seated near the city, and it pours its massive tax revenue into it. Ibn Khaldun uses a beautiful, sweeping analogy. The dynasty is like a massive river that makes everything around it green and fertilizes the soil.
Okay.
But in the distance, away from the river, everything remains dry and dead.
So if the river changes course?
If the dynasty moves its seat of government, for example, when the Abbasids moved from Damascus to Baghdad, or when the Seljuks moved from Baghdad to Isfahan, the river of money abruptly moves with them.
Wow.
The hearts and the wallets of the people are attracted to the new seat of power. The elite population slowly disappears from the old capital to follow the king. And because we established that sedentary culture relies entirely on an abundant population to create that massive economic surplus, the civilization of the old city simply disintegrates.
It becomes a ghost town.
The new rulers will also actively deport the elites, the skilled artisans, and the partisans of the old dynasty to their new home, replacing them in the old city with their own rough militia. The glorious old capital is left with only desperate salesmen, itinerant farm workers, and the mob.
And it isn't just the buildings that crumble and the money that fades. The very language, the way people speak, rots away.
The fading of culture is absolute, extending deeply into linguistics. The text details the tragic decay of the Arabic language in these dying urban centers. The original classical Arabic of the desert founders, the language of the Quran, becomes corrupted by generations of contact with non-Arab populations and the lazy shortcuts of city life.
It loses its structure.
The vowel endings change, the strict grammatical rules are broken, and it morphs into what they call a sedentary language.
It becomes a Creole of the streets.
Yes. And in the East, in non-Arab Iraq, Khorasan, India, when non-Muslim rulers like the Tatars and Mongols eventually took over, the Arabic language was completely doomed. The text notes with sorrow that no trace of it remained in spoken form. It was entirely erased from the public square.
Erased completely.
Even massive scientific books were written exclusively in Persian. Arabic only survived in regions like Egypt, Syria, and the Maghrib because the strict, unyielding religious requirement to study the Quran and the Sunnah artificially preserved it.
So the language is gone, the money is gone, the true rulers are gone, the walls are crumbling. What on earth is left?
What's left is a pathetic, almost theatrical pantomime. In the dying twilight days of a dynasty, when its protective shadow recedes from the remote provinces, local elders in remote towns suddenly realize there's a massive power vacuum.
They see an opening. They want to be the new king.
They do. The text points to the later years of the Hafsid dynasty in the Jared region as a prime example. Local common leaders seized control of the judicial and tax administration because the real government was too weak to stop them.
And what did they do with that power?
Because they deeply aspired to the ways of great rulers but had none of the actual power, they started putting on absurd airs. They sat on elevated thrones, they organized elaborate cavalcades, they used royal seals on their meaningless documents, and demanded to be addressed by the populace as sire.
They are essentially LARPing as kings in the ruins of their own city.
It is exactly that. The text calls it utterly ridiculous in the eyes of all who can objectively observe the situation. They are common people who have adopted royal emblems they are completely unentitled to, pushed into it only by the dwindling influence of the real ruling dynasty.
Just a sad end.
It is the final, senile symptom of a dying realm, the delusion of absolute power in an empty, echoing city.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today in this deep dive. Let's take a breath and recap the sweeping journey we've taken through Ibn Khaldun's mind. We started with the jarring idea that cities are not natural human habitats. They are forced, artificial environments built by the stick of royal authority, relying entirely on the asabiya, the group feeling, forged in the harsh desert.
From there, we explored the illusion of giants, how future generations lack the imagination to comprehend organizational scale, mistaking the power of pulleys and generations of labor for mythological superpowers.
Right. We looked at the extreme, rigorous rationalism of 14th century city planning, debunking magic, smoke, and gabes with brilliant theories of air circulation and population density, and the pragmatic needed to avoid the camel parking mentality to secure water, fields, and defensive walls against naval fleets.
Then we dove deep into the economics of the swarm. The brilliant proto-capitalist realization that population size and human labor dictate wealth-making necessities cheap through massive surplus, and luxuries exorbitantly expensive through demand, bidding wars, and the arrogance of specialized labor.
Which inevitably led to the terrifying real estate cycles, where the ultra-wealthy buy the dip during societal collapse, but then must buy political rank just to avoid being extorted and robbed by jealous rulers who own the courts.
And finally, the biological life cycle of the city. The strict 40-year peak, where extreme luxury inevitably rots the moral and physical courage of the citizens. This leads to trickery, cowardice, the terminal aesthetic of the orange tree, and ends with the city turning to dust the moment the dynasty's river of wealth moves elsewhere, leaving behind only corrupted language and local elders pretending to be kings.
It is a breathtaking, cyclical, and deeply humbling view of human history. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a new angle to ponder based on all of this. We look at our modern megacities today. We look at New York, Tokyo, London, Dubai. And we naturally assume that their towering glass and indestructible steel make them permanent testaments to human mastery. We view them as the final, victorious chapter of human progress.
We view them exactly the way the ancients viewed the reception hall of Khosrow.
Exactly. But Ibn Khaldun reaches across 6 centuries to teach us that the true architecture of a city isn't stone or glass or steel. The true load-bearing architecture is labor and group feeling. And he warns us the springs of water dry up when the udders aren't milked. So I want you to ask yourself, what happens to our modern, highly individualistic, fragmented cities as we move deep into an era of extreme automation, remote work, and unprecedented social isolation? If the shared physical struggle, the daily swarm of human labor, and that vital via vanish from the downtown office blocks, are our concrete jungles already entering their senile stage?
That's a chilling thought.
Are those towering, empty glass skyscrapers just the modern equivalent of the orange tree? Are they just a beautiful, incredibly expensive, utterly useless luxury silently waiting for the forest to reclaim them? Take a look at your own city tomorrow morning and see if you don't look at the skyline just a little bit differently.
Imagine trying to map out like every single way the human mind interacts with reality.
Oh, wow, yeah. That's a huge task.
Right. I mean, not just the clean empirical stuff, the entire spectrum.
Right.
Like the practical mechanics of building a house, all the way to the incredibly rigid rules of a legal debate.
Yeah.
And then even the strange physiological reasons we have nightmares.
Yeah.
Or the mystical, otherworldly visions of saints.
Which is wild to even put in the same sentence today.
Exactly. Usually when we talk about human intelligence today, we compartmentalize all of those things.
Oh, absolutely. We love our categories.
Yeah, we put architecture in one bucket, law in another, and spirituality goes into this completely separate, heavily guarded room.
Which, makes sense in our modern age of hyper-specialization. I mean, we really prefer distinct categories for everything.
We really do.
But historically, separating the physical world from the social world and the supernatural world, that wasn't always the default way of thinking.
And that unified approach, that's exactly the mission of our deep dive today.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating one.
We are going to explore some excerpts from a massive historical masterwork, specifically Chapter 6 of the Muqaddimah.
Right. Written by the 14th century Arab scholar Ibn Khaldun.
Yes. And we're going to dissect his architecture of human thought, looking at how society passes down knowledge and where a thinker from that era actually drew the boundary between the physical world we can touch and the supernatural world we try to perceive.
What makes this text so compelling, at least to me, isn't just its historical weight.
Right.
It presents this really profound, deeply structured philosophical framework about, how we know what we know.
Yeah.
And in an era like ours, where you and I are constantly saturated with data, and we have AI algorithms trying to mimic thought.
Oh, constantly.
Right. Looking at how a 14th century mind categorized the actual engine of human intelligence is remarkably relevant.
Totally. But before we really get into the weeds here, we should probably set the stage for you, the listener.
Yeah, good idea. Some context is definitely needed.
Right. So, this text is deeply rooted in the Islamic Golden Age and the centuries that followed it. It operates within a very specific religious and philosophical framework.
Yeah, dealing heavily with Islamic theology, law, prophecy, and mysticism.
Exactly. And our goal here, just to be super clear, is to explore this fascinating worldview objectively. We are unpacking its concepts of faith, reason, and the divine as a brilliant historical architecture.
Right, without taking sides or endorsing these specific religious viewpoints as, like, objective truth.
Right. We just want to understand how this author constructed his universe.
And to understand that universe, the text argues that before we can even begin to define complex ideas like science or mysticism, we have to break down the primary engine driving all of it,
Which is...
the human ability to think.
Right. The basic engine. And the text breaks human thinking down into 3 very distinct degrees, right? It doesn't just lump all intelligence together into one big pile.
No, not at all. The methodology here is highly sequential. It starts at the absolute baseline, with the first degree, which the text calls the discerning intellect.
The discerning intellect. Okay, so what is that exactly?
It's practical, everyday survival thinking.
Like keeping yourself alive.
Exactly. It's the fundamental cognitive ability that allows a human being to obtain things useful for their livelihood and, repel things that are harmful.
So it's basically the raw arrangement of the physical world into a functional order. So you can eat, find shelter, not get eaten by a bear.
Right, exactly. Baseline physical survival.
Okay, but the text assumes that once you have food and shelter, you immediately run into a brand new problem.
How about other people?
Other people, which leads to the second degree.
Yes, the experimental intellect.
The experimental intellect. I like that name.
Yeah, it's entirely focused on social navigation. The text operates on the premise that humans are inherently political and social creatures.
We can't survive alone.
Right. We cannot survive in complete isolation. But dealing with other human beings inevitably leads to friction.
Oh, yeah. Always.
Strife, competition for those same survival resources. So the experimental intellect is the accumulation of social rules, behavioral norms, and manners that basically prevent a community from just tearing itself apart.
It's like the software of human cooperation.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's learned through direct experience and observation.
Got it. Okay, so then sitting above both basic survival and social navigation, we have the third degree.
Yes, the speculative intellect.
And this one leaves the physical and social worlds behind entirely, right?
Entirely. This is hypothetical knowledge. It involves objects and concepts completely beyond immediate sense perception, without any practical physical activity attached to them.
So like pure philosophy.
Exactly. The search for the underlying reasons, the universal causes, and the abstract realities of existence.
Wow.
The text actually claims that achieving this level of thought represents the absolute perfection of human reality. It transforms a person into pure intellect.
Okay, I want to circle back to that first degree for a second, the discerning intellect. Because the way the text describes the actual mechanics of human action is so fascinating.
Oh, the roof example.
Yes, the roof. It uses this example of building a roof, but it's not giving, like, construction advice.
No.
It's using the roof as an epistemological proof for the temporal nature of human thought.
Yeah, it is a brilliant illustration of how human cognition differs fundamentally from animal instinct.
How so?
Well, the text points out that if you want a roof to shelter yourself, your mind doesn't start at the bottom. It starts at the end goal.
You conceptualize the roof first.
Right. You conceptualize the roof. But to actualize that roof, to actually build it, your mind has to progress backward through a causal chain.
Because a roof can't just float in the air.
Exactly. A roof requires walls to support it, and walls require a foundation to stand on.
So the mental process moves in reverse.
Exactly. Your thinking terminates at the foundation, but when you transition from thought to physical action, you must start where your thinking ended.
Wow. Okay, so you're going to build the foundation, then the walls, and finally the roof.
Right. This leads to one of the text's core maxims, which I love. The beginning of action is the end of thinking, and the beginning of thinking is the end of action.
That is so profound. Human action only materializes in an orderly way in the outside world because we possess this capacity to run a causal regression in our minds.
Yes, and the text makes a really hard distinction here. It argues that animals lack this connecting link entirely.
Their sensory perceptions are disconnected.
Right, because they don't have the mental architecture to run that backward causal chain, their actions aren't orderly in the same way ours are.
And because human action is orderly, we can subordinate all other existent things to our needs.
Exactly. And taking that a step further, the text essentially uses this capacity for causal calculation as a metric for humanity itself.
A metric for humanity? What do you mean?
The author states that a person's, quote, degree of humanity is directly proportional to how many levels deep they can see into a causal chain. Yeah. Most individuals might only be able to string together, say, 2 or 3 links of cause and effect, but others possess the cognitive depth to see 5, 6, or more levels ahead.
Which brings up an analogy in the text that I found just incredibly surprising for a 14th century manuscript.
The chess analogy.
Yes, it compares this cognitive depth to playing chess. It notes that some players can calculate 3 or 5 moves in advance, anticipating the cascade of consequences, while others simply cannot hold that many variables in their minds.
It's an incredibly apt comparison, though, the author is careful to add a nuanced caveat.
Right.
He clarifies that calculating chess moves is largely an acquired habit, whereas perceiving natural causal chains in reality is a function of natural intellect. But as a way to visualize the concept, it works perfectly.
It really does. It's fundamentally about how many steps ahead you can see the board of reality.
Yes.
But this makes me wonder about the implications for us today,
Oh, for sure.
We live in an era where we increasingly outsource that causal calculation. We rely on GPS to plan our routes, algorithms to predict our market trends, and software to manage our logistical chains.
We outsource everything.
We do. So, if the degree of humanity is measured by our internal capacity to run those regressions, does offloading that work to technology atrophy our discerning intellect?
That is a highly relevant philosophical question. And honestly, it transitions perfectly into how the text views the acquisition of the second degree of thought.
The experimental intellect.
Right. Because those social norms and behavioral rules we talked about, they aren't biologically hardwired into us at birth. They have to be acquired.
There is a quote in the text regarding this that is just incredibly stark. I wrote it down. It says, "He who is not educated by his parents will be educated by time."
Oh, that is such a powerful line.
What exactly is the mechanism the text is describing there?
It's describing the societal cost of trial and error learning. The argument is that it is far more efficient for a human being to obtain this experimental social intellect if they just accept instruction from the experience of their elders and teachers.
Right, like listen to the people who have already been there.
Exactly. By absorbing tradition, you bypass the lengthy, often painful process of personal experimentation.
You don't have to ruin your reputation to learn that lying has social consequences because society explicitly warns you beforehand.
Precisely. However, if a person lacks that tradition or willfully refuses to accept instruction,
Like a rebellious teenager.
right, they still require that social intellect to survive because, as we established, human cooperation is mandatory. Consequently, they are forced to learn it directly from raw events over time.
Time becomes their educator.
Time becomes their educator. But the text warns that learning this way is deeply flawed. Their manners will be poorly formed, their social interactions will be fraught with errors, and their overall ability to navigate life will be severely compromised.
Wow. It makes you look at education not just as a transfer of data, but as a vital mechanism for societal stability.
Absolutely.
Which shifts us into how the text views the actual craft of knowledge. It draws a very sharp line between memorization and what it calls the habit of knowledge.
Yeah, the author is highly critical of certain academic practices of his time. He observes students who spend years attending scholarly lectures, sitting in absolute silence, absorbing vast amounts of information.
Downloading data.
Exactly. And because their internal database of facts is larger than a commoner's, these students mistakenly believe they have mastered the scientific habit.
But the text argues that's just baseline understanding.
Right.
It makes the point that you can find basic understanding of a complex problem in a complete beginner, but true mastery of the habit is completely different.
The distinction hinges entirely on active engagement. The text asserts that the only way to acquire the scientific habit is through expressing yourself, debating, and disputing problems.
Silent absorption doesn't cut it.
No, it doesn't create the neural pathways of mastery.
I think of it like learning a foreign language. You can spend years staring at vocabulary flashcards and memorizing verb conjugations, right?
Sure.
Your understanding of the grammar might be perfect on paper, but if you are dropped into a bustling market in another country and have to haggle with a vendor in real time,
You're going to freeze.
you're going to completely freeze. You haven't acquired the habit of the language until you actively use it under pressure. Or even playing an instrument, memorizing the sheet music for a sonata is entirely different from the physical habit of your fingers striking the piano keys.
That physical analogy aligns so well with how the text views the soul's development. The soul literally grows and is polished by the active repetition of these intellectual habits.
Right.
And what's really fascinating is how the text applies this concept of habit on a macro-geographical scale.
Oh, right. It looks at the populations of the East cities like Cairo and Baghdad and compares them to the nomadic Bedouin populations.
Yes.
The text states that the inhabitants of these massive urban centers appear to have an additional intelligence.
It even recounts this popular, almost mythical rumor to emphasize the perceived superiority of Eastern teaching.
I love this part.
The author notes a claim that Egyptians are so incredibly skilled at the craft of instruction that they can teach domestic donkeys and birds to speak words and perform remarkable feats.
Egyptian donkeys taking orders, I mean, that's wild. But the text brings that rumor up specifically to deconstruct the bias behind it, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And the author's sociological insight here is remarkably advanced for the time.
Because the common perception of the era was biological, right?
Exactly.
Mhm.
City dwellers, with their complex sciences and crafts, were simply assumed to be naturally, fundamentally more intelligent than the nomadic Bedouins.
But the text vehemently rejects this.
Completely rejects it.
It states explicitly that the Bedouins possess natural understanding and intellectual perfection of the highest order.
Yes, the difference in perceived cleverness comes down entirely to surplus labor and refined technical habits.
Surplus labor. Okay, unpack that a bit.
So in a large, highly developed civilization, the population generates more labor than is strictly necessary for mere survival.
Because they have agriculture, infrastructure.
Right. They aren't spending every waking moment just trying to find food. So that surplus energy is redirected into developing complex crafts, sciences, and arts.
I see.
And the active practice of these crafts creates habits that add a, quote, polish to the intellect. The city dweller isn't biologically superior.
Their intellect has simply been shaped by an environment that affords them the luxury of rigorous, specialized habit building.
Exactly.
I find that incredibly compelling because it shifts the burden of intelligence from genetics to environment and effort.
It really does.
It suggests that knowledge requires surplus societal energy and active participation. It makes me wonder how often we confuse someone's access to highly polished habits with their raw intellectual capacity.
It's a vital distinction. Consuming information is a passive state. Cultivating the habit of wisdom requires the surplus energy to debate and actively engage.
So if that is the mechanism of how we learn, the text then pivots to categorize what we learn.
Right, the grand taxonomy of knowledge.
It takes the entirety of human knowledge and divides it into two massive, distinct frameworks.
The foundational division here is between the philosophical sciences and the traditional or conventional sciences.
Okay, let's break those down.
Well, the philosophical sciences are those guided purely by the human speculative intellect. Through observation, research, and logical deduction, human beings can navigate these fields to discover truths about the natural world completely independently.
So things like physics, astronomy, medicine.
Exactly. But the traditional sciences operate under a completely different set of rules.
Entirely different.
Right. The traditional sciences depend fundamentally on authority. Specifically, the religious law derived from the Quran and the Sunnah, which are the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay.
And the author is uncompromising in his definition here. He states unequivocally that there is no place for the human intellect in the traditional sciences.
Okay, I have to admit, I'm struggling with that leap.
It sounds counterintuitive, right?
Yeah. How can a science have absolutely zero intellect involved? I mean, even the basic act of reading a historical text, parsing its grammar, and understanding its context, that requires human reasoning, doesn't it?
Okay, yes. The text isn't suggesting that the scholars were unthinking automatons.
Right.
By no place for the intellect, the author means the intellect cannot originate the core truths or laws within this sphere.
Oh, I see.
In the philosophical sciences, your mind can deduce that gravity exists through observation. But in the traditional sciences, your mind cannot logically deduce a divine command.
You can't just logic your way into a specific religious ritual.
Exactly. You can only receive it from the text. The intellect's role is strictly administrative, managing and categorizing the revealed knowledge.
Except for one specific tool the text mentions.
Yes. Analogical reasoning.
Right. Analogical reasoning.
That is the crucial exception. As society advanced, new, highly specific situations constantly emerged that were not explicitly addressed in the foundational texts from centuries prior.
Because the texts were written in a specific time and place.
Exactly. So the intellect was permitted to use analogy to connect a new problem back to an established principle. The basic principle itself remains traditional and unquestioned, but the intellect builds a bridge to it.
And the text traces how this reliance on texts and analogy led to the massive evolution in jurisprudence.
Yeah.
And I was struck by the historical reality of the very early days of Islam. The men who handed down legal decisions, they weren't known as jurists or legal scholars. They were simply called readers.
That title really reflects the demographic reality of the early Arab society, which was predominantly illiterate.
Right.
The ability to simply read the Quran was a specialized, highly respected skill.
Mm.
The legal authority naturally fell to the men who could physically access the texts.
The guys who could actually read the words on the page.
Right, and who had memorized which verses abrogated others, and who understood the linguistic nuances.
But as the society expanded into these massive urban centers, and illiteracy began to vanish because the population was so focused on studying the texts, just being able to read was no longer a unique qualification.
Exactly. Reading evolved into a complex science of interpretation. And those original readers evolved into the specialized jurists.
And the complexity of the jurisprudence they developed was staggering. The text points to the science of inheritance laws as a prime example of how intellectually demanding this became.
Oh, the inheritance math. It's intense.
It is. Dividing an estate was not merely a matter of reading a single verse and handing out coins. It required an incredibly dense application of mathematics.
To say the least.
Let me test my understanding of this, because the math gets wild.
Go for it.
Okay, imagine a 14th century merchant dies. He leaves behind a wife, 2 adult sons, and a daughter. Religious law dictates specific fractional shares for each of them. But before the legal estate can be fully inventoried and distributed, one of the adult sons dies.
Which happens frequently in an era before modern medicine.
Right. So now that deceased son's fractional share has to be recalculated and redistributed among his own heirs. Say, a pregnant wife and a cousin.
It gets complicated fast.
But then, to complicate it even further, the original merchant had a brother who steps forward, claiming he was owed a massive debt by the estate, which has to be paid out before any fractional division even begins.
And that is exactly why the jurists had to become mathematicians.
It's a nightmare.
It is. When you are dealing with cascading deaths, shifting acknowledgments of heirs, debt deductions, and specific fractional mandates, you cannot solve the division with simple arithmetic.
No way.
The text details how these scholars had to heavily utilize algebra, complex fractions, and the extraction of roots just to determine the correct proportional shares.
The legal scholars basically had to invent advanced actuarial tables.
They really did. It became such a mathematically rigorous endeavor that it was recognized as an entirely separate discipline.
Wow.
Though I have to say, the author does wryly note that some scholars enjoyed showing off their mathematical prowess.
Oh, by inventing those incredibly convoluted hypothetical algebra problems.
Yes, problems regarding inheritance that had absolutely zero practical application in reality.
The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. Academic flexes are timeless.
Truly.
But, okay, as these legal systems grew more complex and scholars inevitably disagreed on how to apply these rules, it gave rise to what might be the most fascinating discipline in the entire text.
The science of dialectics?
Yes, dialectics. It formalized the architecture of argumentation.
It really did.
It is the science of proper behavior in a dispute. The text openly acknowledges human nature here, which I appreciate. When scholars from different legal schools debate a complex issue, emotions run high.
Of course.
As the author puts it, each disputant lets himself go, and without structure, an argument devolves into chaos.
It just becomes shouting.
Exactly. So they created an entire scientific discipline just to govern the rules of engagement.
It dictated incredibly specific protocols. It governed the exact conditions under which a person could advance an argument, how the respondent was obligated to reply.
And critically, the specific points at which a disputant was required to be silent and permit their opponent to speak.
Yes, it even codified the precise manner in which a person must admit defeat.
Think about the absolute lack of that discipline today.
Oh, it's non-existent.
If you look at the chaos of modern discourse, cable news, shouting matches, social media comment sections where the only goal is to dunk on the opponent, the idea of an agreed-upon formalized science dictating how to properly admit defeat seems like a lost utopian concept.
It really does.
Yeah.
But the necessity of dialectics becomes obvious when you look at how deeply fractured the legal scholars actually were.
Right.
The text breaks down the major methodological divides. On one side, you had the Iraqis, centered in regions like Kufa, around figures like Abu Hanifa. Because they were geographically further from the Hijaz, the birthplace of Islam, they had access to fewer direct traditions. Consequently, they relied heavily on human reasoning, analogy, and logical deduction to expand the law.
And on the other side, you had the Hijazis, represented by scholars like Malik.
Yes, the Hijazis were centered in Medina, so they were surrounded by the direct physical legacy of the Prophet's traditions.
They had all the source material right there.
Exactly. They possessed an abundance of established texts and societal practices, so they relied much more strictly on those traditions, utilizing analogy only when absolutely necessary.
But then you have a third group the text mentions, the Zahirites,
Ah, the Zahirites.
who took the traditional approach to its absolute rigid extreme.
They were the ultimate literalists.
Yeah.
They completely rejected the Iraqi use of analogy.
Completely.
Yes. They argued that the religious law was comprised only of what was explicitly written in the unambiguous texts and the established consensus. If a specific problem wasn't mentioned in the text, they refused to use human reasoning to bridge the gap.
Wow. The text mentions that by the 14th century, the Zahirite school had essentially gone extinct.
It did.
But I'm curious about the mechanism of that failure. Why did a strict literalist movement collapse in a society that was so deeply religious?
It collapsed because absolute literalism is practically incompatible with a dynamic, evolving society.
Give me an example.
Okay, consider the economic realities of the time. Imagine the vast trade networks expanding across the Silk Roads. A new type of complex promissory note or financial instrument is invented by merchants in Damascus to facilitate long-distance trade.
Okay, so something brand new that didn't exist when the texts were written.
Right. Now, the Iraqi scholars would look at this new promissory note, analyze its underlying mechanics, find an analogical comparison to a traditional ruling on debt or trade, and issue a legal framework allowing merchants to use it ethically.
They build a bridge.
They build a bridge. But the Zahirites wouldn't be able to do that.
Because it's not explicitly in the text.
Exactly. The Zahirites would look at the text and say, this specific promissory note is not mentioned in the Quran or the Sunnah, therefore we cannot rule on it.
So they just offer nothing.
They offered no legal mechanism to adapt. And if merchants cannot enforce contracts or navigate new economic realities under your legal system, they will abandon it.
That makes so much sense.
The Zahirites were too inflexible to survive the friction of real-world progression. And as the text notes, the great mass of the public eventually rejected them entirely.
So humanity builds this incredibly rigorous, mathematically dense, heavily debated system of jurisprudence to govern every physical and social interaction.
Right.
But what happens when the human mind takes that exact same rigorous logical tool set and tries to apply it to the ultimate nature of existence?
Ah, that brings us to speculative theology.
Speculative theology. Okay, what is that?
It was the attempt to defend the core articles of faith using the logical proofs of the speculative intellect. It wasn't just about believing in the oneness of God or the afterlife. It was about mathematically, logically proving it. The theologians analyzed the conditions of the physical world, looking at the composition of a body, or the mechanics of motion, not merely as physical phenomena, but as logical arguments proving the existence of a creator.
But the text issues a profound warning here about what it calls the regression of causes.
Yes.
If we go back to our roof analogy from the beginning, human intelligence works by tracing an effect back to its cause. The roof is caused by the walls by the foundation.
Exactly.
We naturally attempt to apply that exact same regression to the universe.
We observe a natural phenomenon and we logically deduce its immediate cause. But then the intellect demands to know the cause of that cause.
Right.
The causal chain multiplies, widening horizontally across all of nature and stretching vertically backward through time.
And the text argues that if you attempt to trace this chain all the way to its ultimate conclusion, the intellect will inevitably hit a wall and become utterly confused.
It shorts out.
Yeah. You trace the causes until you reach the causer of causes, God. But if your intellect tries to cross that boundary, if you try to logically dissect the mechanics of that ultimate cause, using the exact same tools you used to deduce the foundation of a house.
The text says a man stops, his feet slip, and he becomes one of those who go astray and perish.
It is a demand for absolute epistemological humility.
It is. The text explicitly states, a man who stops at the causes is frustrated. You have to recognize when the tool you're using is no longer appropriate for the medium.
Right. And the author uses this magnificent, enduring analogy here. He describes the speculative intellect as a correct scale.
Yes, the scale analogy, it's brilliant.
Within its proper domain, its indications are completely certain and objectively true.
But the domain is limited.
Precisely. You have a perfectly calibrated, flawless scale designed for weighing gold.
Right.
But you cannot take that gold weighing scale and attempt to use it to weigh a mountain.
It will shatter.
The scale isn't broken. It's perfectly designed for the gold, but trying to put a mountain on it will destroy it. It's like trying to measure the temperature of the sun with a kitchen meat thermometer.
Exactly.
The thermometer isn't flawed, it just lacks the capacity for the sheer magnitude of the data.
Right.
The text argues that the human intellect simply does not have the capacity to weigh matters, like the ultimate oneness of God, the mechanics of the afterlife, or the reality of divine prophecy.
And to drive this point home, the author constructs this thought experiment regarding our physical limitations.
Okay.
He asks us to consider a person who is born entirely deaf. To this individual, the entirety of human existence is comprised exclusively of what they can feel, see, taste, smell, and intellectually deduce.
The entire spectrum of the audible world, the sound of music, the spoken word, the rustling of leaves, is completely absent from their reality.
Exactly. And the same applies to a person born blind regarding the visible world. If these individuals did not possess a deeply ingrained trust in the testimony of their parents, teachers, and society, they would logically conclude that sound and color do not exist, simply because their personal sensory apparatus cannot perceive them.
Wow. And the text makes the macro leap. Humanity as a whole is essentially in the exact same position.
Yes.
We observe the physical universe with our five senses and our speculative intellect, and we arrogantly assume that our perception encompasses the entirety of existence. We dismiss anything that falls outside our bandwidth.
But the text insists the world of existence is too vast for him. We must remain deeply suspicious of the comprehensiveness of our own perception.
Because there might be colors we can't see.
Exactly. There's a vast, expansive, unseen universe that our intellectual scale is simply too small to measure.
Which introduces a really fascinating psychological distinction the text makes regarding how we internalize truth. It draws a hard line between possessing knowledge of something and achieving a state of being.
Ah, yes. The orphan example.
Right, and it illustrates this with the example of an orphan.
It's an incredibly perceptive look at human behavior. The text points out the vast gulf between intellectualizing an attribute and actually possessing it.
What do you mean?
Well, through the study of religious law and ethics, a vast majority of people know on an intellectual level that showing mercy to an orphan or a destitute person is a morally good action that brings them closer to the divine.
Okay, sure.
They have successfully reached this station of knowledge.
But the text points out that if many of those exact same people actually encountered an orphan in the physical world, their instinct would be to avoid them, or they would disdain to interact with them.
Exactly. Their knowledge of mercy is just a data point. It hasn't altered their fundamental nature.
Right, but contrast that with individuals who have attained a higher station. They possess the actual attribute of mercy.
Yes. When they encounter suffering, they do not need to intellectually calculate the moral value of helping. They spontaneously show compassion because it has become their intrinsic nature.
They have transitioned from merely knowing a fact to embodying a state. I find that concept so challenging in a modern context.
Oh, it's a direct call-out.
Because we have access to an infinite amount of knowledge today. We know the data on what constitutes a healthy lifestyle. We know the psychological benefits of patience. We know the societal cost of our consumption habits.
We have all the data.
But how much of that data is just sitting in the station of knowledge?
Most of it, honestly.
The text insists that knowledge alone is practically useless. The ultimate goal is to convert that knowledge into a state through rigorous, repeated action until it becomes a firmly rooted habit of the soul.
It mirrors the earlier discussion on the craft of teaching. You cannot just memorize the vocabulary of virtue. You have to actively speak the language until it becomes second nature.
So this brings us to a massive threshold in the text.
It does.
If our waking intellect is a scale that shatters when trying to weigh mountains, and our physical senses are like a blind person completely unaware of the spectrum of color around them, how do human beings ever actually access this unseen reality?
Right. How do we cross over?
How do we perceive beyond the physical bandwidth?
According to the architecture of this text, access to the unseen world only occurs when the heavy veil of physical sense perception is lifted.
Okay.
And for the vast, overwhelming majority of humanity, that lifting of the veil happens involuntarily every single night when we go to sleep.
Wow. Okay, so the text categorizes the human experience into 4 distinct levels. First, the body, which encompasses our waking senses and practical intellect.
Right.
Second is sleep, the world of dream visions. Third is prophecy, representing direct divine revelation. And fourth is death, encompassing the metaphysical realms of purgatory and resurrection.
What is truly remarkable about the text's treatment of the second level sleep is that it doesn't just dismiss dreams as mystical metaphors.
No, it goes deep into the biology.
It provides a highly detailed 14th century physiological explanation for the actual mechanics of dreaming. It centers entirely around a biological concept it calls the spirit of the heart.
And it describes this spirit not as an abstract ghost, but as a physical fine vapor that originates in the fleshy cavity of the heart and pumps through the veins and blood to the extremities of the body.
Yes, it is the vital energy source that literally powers our animal sensations and waking actions.
Okay, so to understand the mechanics, imagine the human body as a sprawling city, and this fine vapor is the electrical current powering the entire grid.
I like that analogy.
During the day, massive amounts of current are routed outward to the industrial districts, the 5 senses of sight, hearing, touch, etc.
The system is operating at maximum capacity just to process the physical world.
But at night, the text notes that the chill of the air covers the body's surface.
And the city shuts down.
The industrial districts are turned off.
Exactly. The external senses become unemployed. And because they no longer require power, that vital electrical current, the spirit of the heart, retreats from the extremities and routes back to the central mainframe.
And here is where the physiological meets the supernatural. The text argues that this physical vapor, the spirit of the heart, serves as the vehicle or the carrier for a human being's rational spirit.
Yes. And the core essence of this rational spirit is actually identical in nature to the divine, unseen world.
But while we are awake, that rational spirit is completely preoccupied.
The central mainframe is entirely consumed by the massive data processing required to run the physical senses. The soul is heavily veiled by the body.
But when we sleep and the power routes back, that veil is temporarily lifted.
Yes. The rational spirit is suddenly unburdened from managing the physical body. It now has the immense surge of undivided energy required to look beyond the physical bandwidth.
It catches a brief glimpse of its own spiritual realm, receives a supernatural perception, and then brings that perception back down, passing it to the brain's imagination.
It is a beautifully constructed mechanical theory. However, the author is deeply pragmatic and recognizes that not every dream is a profound glimpse into the divine.
Obviously not.
He categorizes dreams strictly into 2 types: true dreams and confused dreams.
Confused dreams are exactly what they sound like.
They're simply the residual noise of the central mainframe. It is the imagination shuffling through stored memories, anxieties, and daily preoccupations.
Like when you dream about forgetting your locker combination.
Exactly. The text notes that these confused dreams occur strictly within the confines of sequential time and are highly susceptible to being forgotten upon waking because they are merely physical data processing.
But true dreams operate on a completely different frequency. And the text provides very specific diagnostic criteria for identifying them.
The primary diagnostic sign of a true dream is the physical reaction upon waking.
Because the soul is receiving a perception from a vastly superior, heavier divine realm, the experience is overwhelming, right?
Yes. The rational spirit intuitively recognizes the danger of being exposed to that magnitude of reality without the buffer of the physical senses, so it forcefully snaps back into the waking state. A true dream wakes you up rapidly.
The second diagnostic sign is the clarity of the memory. A true dream is instantly burned into your consciousness with absolute precision.
The text argues this is because the soul's perception of the divine doesn't happen sequentially, in pieces over time, but rather all at once in a single, unified flash.
It circumvents the brain's normal, flawed memory encoding process.
Exactly.
But even when you experience a true dream, you aren't usually receiving a literal, explicitly worded message. It's not like getting an email from the unseen world telling you to invest in a specific trade rep tomorrow.
No, because there is a translation barrier. The rational spirit perceives a pure, abstract, divine concept. But to deliver that concept to the waking consciousness, it has to pass it through the physical brain, specifically the faculty of the imagination.
And the imagination can only process information using the vocabulary of the physical world.
So it translates abstract divine ideas into physical symbols.
This is the foundation of the science of dream interpretation. The imagination acts as a metaphorical translator. If the soul perceives the abstract concept of a mighty, overwhelming ruler, the imagination cannot draw an abstract concept, so it paints a picture of a vast, powerful ocean.
If the soul perceives hidden hostility, the imagination translates that into the image of a serpent.
Therefore, the practitioner of dream interpretation has to reverse engineer the process.
Right. They listen to the client describe a dream about an ocean. They identify the ocean as merely the physical symbol generated by the imagination, and through analogical comparison, knowing an ocean is immense and dominant, they deduce that the true underlying perception was a warning about a ruler.
Okay, so sleep provides humanity with an accidental, heavily symbolized glimpse of the unseen world because the power grid of the senses shuts down.
Yes.
But what about the third level, the prophets? How does their access to the unseen differ from a dreamer?
Prophets occupy an entirely different ontological category. They do not require the passive shutdown of sleep to lift the veil.
They can just do it.
The text asserts that prophets are created with a unique, innate predisposition that allows them to actively strip away their human condition and transition into the spiritual world of angelicality while they're entirely awake. They cross the boundary instantaneously.
But the text describes this conscious crossing as exacting a terrifying physical toll on the human body.
Oh, massive.
It notes that during these moments of revelation, prophets experience immense strain, heavy sweating, and sensations akin to choking.
Because the physical human architecture was simply not designed to process the raw data of the unseen world while the sensory grid is still active. The scale is being forced to weigh the mountain.
Wow.
But the crucial distinction is clarity. Unlike dreamers who receive abstract concepts filtered through the murky symbols of the imagination, prophets receive direct, unadulterated observation.
The veil is completely obliterated.
There is no symbolic translation, no room for error, and no need for interpretation. And when they transition back to their human state, they retain the absolute certainty of that knowledge to guide society.
Which is an overwhelming singular experience. But that brings us to the final major exploration in the text.
Yes.
We have sleepers who get accidental glimpses and prophets who are divinely chosen to endure the direct experience. But the text explores a specific subculture of individuals who actively, intentionally attempt to force the veil open while they are awake without prophetic mandate.
The mystics.
The Sufis. The text provides a fascinating historical tracking of Sufism. It points out that in the earliest generations of Islam, Sufism wasn't a distinct mystical science. It was simply rigorous asceticism.
It was a commitment to total devotion, isolating oneself from the corruption of the world and rejecting false splendor and material wealth.
But as the Islamic Empire expanded into vast, wealthy urban centers and the general population became increasingly consumed by worldly aspirations, these ascetics coalesced into a distinct, identifiable group.
And their focus shifted from merely rejecting the world to actively seeking a specific kind of perception, gnosis, or mystical knowledge obtained through ecstatic experience.
And they developed a highly systematized methodology to achieve this.
They did.
The text observes that while a conventionally pious person might simply perform an act of charity and move on, the Sufi engages in relentless self-scrutiny.
They investigate the underlying results and psychological motivations of their obedience. They believe that any deficiency in their spiritual connection is the direct result of hidden internal psychological defects.
It is essentially a rigorous, almost clinical science of the soul. Their methodology involves progressing through distinct spiritual stations, and the primary mechanism they use is the intentional mortification of the physical body.
Yes, they systematically starve the external senses through extreme fasting, sleep deprivation, and sustained isolation.
They are essentially trying to artificially induce the mechanics of sleep while remaining awake.
Exactly.
By starving the industrial districts of the power grid, they hope to forcefully route all that vital energy to the rational spirit, empowering it to tear through the veil of sensual perception on demand.
That is their ultimate goal. And when they believe they have successfully removed the veil, they claim to perceive the true realities of existence, glimpses of future events, and direct visions of the divine worlds.
Yeah.
However, the text issues a profound, deeply structured warning about the extreme danger of this methodology. It introduces the critical concept of the mirror.
The mirror concept. Okay, let's unpack this. The text states that the Sufis themselves do not consider any mystical vision to be valid or sound unless it originates from a state of absolute straightforwardness.
Right.
And it compares the human soul to a mirror.
It is a vital epistemological safeguard. The author acknowledges that individuals outside of the religious tradition, like sorcerers or ascetics from other philosophical disciplines who engage in extreme physical starvation, might actually succeed in temporarily lifting the veil.
So the technique works.
The technique works.
Right.
But if the soul of the individual lacks pure straightforwardness, if it is still corrupted by ego, hidden desires, or unexamined biases, that soul acts like a convex or concave mirror.
So whatever supernatural reality it reflects will be horribly warped.
Exactly. The object being reflected might be real, but the distorted mirror of a flawed soul will present it in a warped, dangerous, or deceptive form.
That is terrifying.
Only a perfectly flat mirror, a soul that has achieved absolute, flawless straightforwardness, can reflect the divine reality accurately. Therefore, a novice attempting to hack their way into mystical states without first undergoing decades of rigorous psychological purification is playing an incredibly dangerous game.
Their own internal defects will distort the unseen reality, leading them into profound delusion.
And the text points to the physical manifestation of this danger, which it refers to as ecstatic utterances.
Yes. When these mystics successfully detach from sense perception and are gripped by the overwhelming intensity of divine inspiration, they sometimes utter bizarre, incomprehensible, and frequently heretical statements.
Yes.
These are declarations that they would never rationally make if they were grounded in their normal, waking human state.
The text specifically references the infamous historical case of Al-Hallaj.
Al-Hallaj.
Al-Hallaj was a highly prominent 10th century mystic who, while in an ecstatic state, famously declared, "I as the truth."
Okay, which is a big deal.
It's a massive deal. The context of Islamic theology, the truth is a direct attribute and name of God. Therefore, his statement was interpreted as a literal claim to divinity, which is absolute unforgivable heresy. He was subsequently tried and executed by the authorities.
But the way the text analyzes the legal justification for his execution is incredibly nuanced. The jurists didn't simply kill him just because the words were heretical.
No, the legal reasoning was far more intricate. The text explains that the jurists condemned Al-Hallaj because they determined he uttered those heretical words while still in control of his state.
He had not completely severed his connection to the physical sensory world.
The text argues a crucial legal loophole. If a mystic is so completely overwhelmed by divine inspiration that they are entirely disconnected from their physical senses, if they are, for all intents and purposes, completely out of their waking mind, they are legally excused.
Because they literally don't know what they're doing.
Right. The law cannot punish someone who lacks the cognitive agency to be spoken to or to control their actions.
So, if you are genuinely 100% lost in the spiritual ether, you cannot be held liable for what your mouth says. But if you have even one foot planted in the physical reality of the human world, and you utter heresy, the physical law applies to you and you face the executioner.
Because you are still actively participating in the social architecture that the experimental intellect built to keep society stable.
And the text makes one final brilliant linguistic observation regarding why these ecstatic utterances happen in the first place.
This is one of my favorite points.
It points out a fundamental structural limitation of human language. It states, no language can express the things that Sufis want to say, because languages have been invented only for the expression of commonly accepted concepts, most of which apply to the sensibilia.
Human vocabulary was engineered exclusively to describe the physical world, things we can touch, see, measure, and socially interact with.
So, when a mystic attempts to describe a formless, transcendent, non-physical experience using a tool built exclusively for physical reality, the tool breaks down.
It's fundamentally impossible.
It is like trying to explain the vivid nuance of the color red to someone who has been totally blind since birth. The conceptual framework simply does not exist.
It forces us to recognize that the highest levels of understanding, according to this architecture, are deeply intuitive and inherently untranslatable.
Which brings us to a place where we need to step back and synthesize the sheer magnitude of the journey we've just taken through this 14th century text.
It's a lot to take in.
The ambition of Ibn Khaldun in constructing this architecture is truly breathtaking.
It is an attempt at a genuine unified theory of human existence. We started at the most granular physiological level, a fine vapor pumping from the cavity of the heart to power our physical survival.
We examined the basic, backward causal reasoning required to simply build a roof over our heads.
We scaled up to the experimental intellect, looking at the behavioral norms we have to absorb from our elders to avoid being painfully educated by time.
We watched reading evolve into the rigorous mathematical discipline of inheritance law, and we saw society invent the formal science of dialectics just to figure out how to argue without destroying each other.
And then we pushed the human intellect to its absolute limits, watching it trace the regression of causes until it hit the immovable wall of speculative theology, where the scale shatters under the weight of the mountain.
Only to discover that when the waking mind finally exhausts itself and shuts down the power grid of the senses, the rational spirit takes over.
It reaches beyond the veil and the symbolism of sleep, or endures the terrifying physical toll of prophetic revelation, or navigates the dangerous mirror-warping asceticism of the mystics.
It is a profound reminder that historical thinkers did not isolate knowledge. They strove to integrate the mechanical, the social, and the spiritual into one coherent, magnificent structure.
They understood that to truly comprehend the universe, you first have to rigorously examine the instrument that is perceiving it, the human mind, with all of its profound capabilities and its inherent structural flaws.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. We are living in an era where our discerning intellect, our capacity to calculate causes and manipulate the physical world, has been infinitely magnified by supercomputers and artificial intelligence.
Infinitely.
We can now run causal chains millions of variables deep in a fraction of a second. But when we look back at this 14th century warning about the scale-weighing mountains, we have to ask ourselves, are we falling into the trap of using those exact same algorithmic tools to try and calculate the ultimate meaning of our lives, our morality, or our spiritual purpose?
Are we trying to optimize the human soul with the exact same math we use to build our roofs?
What modern veils are keeping you from seeing the bigger picture today?
We have to recognize when the tool has reached its limit and when it is time to simply look inward.
Because when it comes to mapping the entirety of the human experience, the picture is never just binary. And perhaps the most vital truths of our existence are the ones that fundamentally cannot be measured.